everybody, and welcome to Section 6, which is going to be covering 3 things that we've already done so far this year and show you the connection between them. Something that happens a lot in math is sometimes it feels like you're learning a bunch of separate skills that don't overlap. But my goal as your teacher is to make sure we understand why are we learning equations and then percents and then proportions and all of these, and how does one skill help us learn the others. So the example I want to start with today is actually my wife and I just recently went to a restaurant in Waterville called the Jewel of India. Super good food, really delicious. And at the bottom, they gave me a receipt that had the tip percentages listed on it. And if you've ever paid at a restaurant, you know that you give a tip for the service. And it told me the tip of 15% should be this much money. The tip of 18% should be this much money. And I thought that was really cool. You can tell this is my receipt because it's got grease on it. So, of course, it's mine. I spill all over the place. But I couldn't help but think, what if there was a mistake on this sheet? How many people would actually catch it? And I didn't double check at the time. So I wanted to put in the video to show you that's the skill that we can cover. Where do these numbers come from, and how could we check if they're correct? Before we start, I want to really emphasize percent, and especially if you haven't been in my class before, you know that I really hammer percent. The word percent means per century. And a century has 100 years, so per 100. Which means whenever you're dealing with a percentage, you're dealing with something out of 100% per century. So that means when we're finding the connection between fractions, decimals, and percents, we should remember that these are actually the exact same thing. If I have the fraction 3/4, to make it a percent, I need to make that fraction per 100. So if I take both of these numbers times 25, I end up getting 75 hundredths as a fraction. 75 hundredths as a fraction is same as the decimal 75 hundredths, and therefore is equivalent to the percentage 75%. So percent per century per 100. Now if we're given a decimal, and that decimal doesn't have a clean hundredth number. We notice here this is the tenths place, this is the hundredths place, so our percentage will stop right there. Now, some teachers might let you round, but in my case, I don't want you to unless you absolutely have no other choice. Instead, you should do 68 and an extra decimal, and that is your percentage. Now, this is a little bit trickier here as a fraction because I have to do tenths, hundredths, and then thousandths. So I can't write the fraction the same way as I did before. I have to write it as thousandths. And then if I was asking you to simplify, you could simplify this fraction down. For the last problem, we should know that 100% is equal to 1 whole. So anything that's more than 100% will have to be a mixed number. So I break this up into 100% and an extra 8%, and that's how I'm going to write my fraction. To simplify this, I can divide both of these numbers by 2 to get 1 and 4/50ths. I can divide by 2 again to get 1 and 2/25ths. To write this as a decimal is actually quite a bit easier. We go back here. We simply think once again that 2 decimals, where would the hundredths go? Except this time it's over 1 whole. So that would mean that we have 1 and 8 hundredths. So the same idea, except that over 1 over 100%. So if you haven't done that before, or that's totally new to you, make sure you talk to me so that we can break through some examples and make sure we understand conversions between fractions, decimals, and percents. The reason why we do those conversions is to help us solve percent of. And when you see percent of, the operation that you'll be doing is multiplication. Now, you can multiply as a decimal or you can multiply as a fraction, but you are going to be multiplying the whole number times the percentage. So for the number 25%, I hope you know that 25% is equal to the fraction 25 hundredths or the fraction 1/4. So I would do 1/4 times 120, make those both into fractions, and then I can multiply out that way. I would get 120 fourths, which is equal to 60 halves, or the number 30. 1/4 of 120 is 30. Now you can also do this as a decimal. If I turn 25% into the decimal 25 hundredths, I can then multiply times 120, which we do with the standard algorithm, remembering that there are 2 digits behind the decimal place when we're done. 5 times 0 is 0. 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 5 is 5, plus an extra 1 is 6. And I end up getting 3,000, but remembering there are 2 digits behind the decimal point, so my answer is once again 30. So, and I'm showing you this to show that once again, when you are doing percent of, you can do fractions or decimals. Now, I know we're going a little quick through this, but my assumption is that you've seen most of this before. If any of this is totally new, you need to let me know so we can work through some of it together. Let's do one more example. I'm going to show you either fractions or decimals, and for the rest of the video, I'm going to pick one or the other. So, 40% of 250, I can do this as a fraction, which is 4/10, or 2/5. So if I do 2/5 times 250, now I can multiply across to get 500 over 5, which is equal to 100. 40% of 250 is equal to 100. You can do the decimal algorithm here, but there is one more strategy that I personally love. If I'm looking for 40% of a number, sometimes I like to think of a percentage that I could do without any actual calculation at all. For example, 10% of 250 should be equal to 25 using place value strategies. But then, if I'm going from 40 or 10% to 40%, I hope that you know you're multiplying by 4. Therefore, if I take 25 times 4, I end up getting the same answer again. Once again, if any of this is new, let me know. Now we're going to get into some examples that are new, and so we're going to slow down a little bit. Now, the big goal here is to remember our connections between percents, equations, and proportions, the 3 big things we've covered so far this year. So if I'm given a problem, what is 20% of 210? This usually happens in a problem with some type of story based around it. That you've identified the question as what is 20% of 210, and now you need to solve it. So if we're going to be solving this with a linear equation, right up here, the strategy we have to do is identify the keywords in the problem and then make an equation. So the first keyword is actually something we covered earlier, which was percent of, and really emphasizing that of. Percent of, if you remember, is multiplication. So right here means there is a multiplication between 20% and 210. Now we have to identify a few more other keywords. Of is the big number 1. Is the second. And sometimes you'll get is or is equal to, things like that. Well, is almost always going to be an equal sign. Is equal to. It's going to be what separates our equation. And the third part is the whole reason we have algebra in the first place, is if you're looking for something that is unknown, that's where you have a variable, something like x or y or z. So now I have the three big components, and everything else in my problem is filled with a number. So I move 20% down, and I move 210 down. So then I'm just going to rewrite my equation as x equals 20% of 210. And now we just have a one-step equation. X is already alone, so we simply have to do 20% of 210, which is 10% would be 21. So 20% would have to be twice as much, or 42. And that's the entire problem. What's nice about this is it never really gets more difficult than that. So we did it with a linear equation, but I said I was going to prove to you the connection between our linear equations and our proportions. Let's go back to the original problem up here. And instead of keywords, we are going to do a proportion. Now, a proportion is always two fractions set equal to each other. Now we need to figure out from our information what are the two fractions. Well, fraction number 1 is going to be the percentage. Now it can be either or, but I do the percent on the left. It does not matter. And then the number on the right is going to be what you're finding. So the number you're finding. In this case, we're looking for 20% of 210, so it's whatever that is equal to is the number we're finding. So the percent actually fills out very quickly. 20% is just the fraction 20 out of 100. So that one actually goes very quickly. But the number you're finding, this is the part that's easy to mix up. 210 is going to go either in the numerator or the denominator of our second fraction. But what I want you to think about is if we are finding 20% of something, which in this case is 210, that has to be smaller than what we started with. Because the answer is going to be smaller, we need the x to be across from the smaller number. In this case, 20. Then 210 ends up down here on the denominator, and all we do is we cross multiply. So we get 100 is equal to 4,200 times, x should be here. Totally missed the x. And then to solve it, we divide both sides by 100. And once again, x is equal to 42.